The man had lived many years of his life in service of his country. He was not the kind of person who sought out recognition or wanted his name printed in the newspapers. He was quiet by nature, steady in his actions, and known in his community for his respectful way of dealing with people. Those who lived near him admired him not only because he had served, but because he never carried himself with arrogance. He was one of those people who had seen both the best and worst of humanity during his time away. Yet when he came home, he decided to focus on small, simple things, raising his family, working hard, and being present for his loved ones. In his neighborhood, people often described him as a man who walked with calm dignity. He had strong shoulders that carried not just his own burdens, but those of others when needed. He helped neighbors fix broken fences, offered rides to people who didn't have transport, and would quietly check on older residents who lived alone. Many people respected him because he didn't talk much about his service, but when he did, it was never to brag. He would speak about the men and women he served alongside, the friendships formed under tough conditions, and the lessons he learned about patience and endurance. At home, his role was even more important. He was a father who believed in teaching his children through example more than words. His son especially grew up watching how his father lived, never wasting time, never taking shortcuts, and always putting family first. This son admired his father deeply. Even when he was young, he understood that his father's life had been built on discipline and sacrifice. Later in life, those lessons would shape him in ways no one could have predicted. Life for the veteran was not always easy. Like many who returned from service, he carried invisible scars. Nights were sometimes restless, and he would sit awake in silence, not wanting to disturb anyone else. But he never allowed his struggles to define him. Instead, he pushed forward, waking early in the mornings, sometimes before the sun had risen, to begin his day. He believed in the value of hard work and often told his family that effort and honesty were worth more than anything money could buy. His son grew up in this environment of quiet strength. While his father never demanded respect, he earned it naturally. The boy watched him carefully, absorbing the way he treated people, the way he handled hardship, and the way he never gave up. The son wanted to make his father proud, and with each step in his life, he kept his father's teachings in mind. As he grew older, he would find himself achieving things that surprised even those who knew him well. But at this early stage of the story, he was still just a child looking up to a man who seemed larger than life. The veteran also had a close connection with his wider family. He was the kind of relative who made sure gatherings were filled with laughter. Though he was serious at times, he could also smile warmly, and his laughter had a way of easing tension. He believed in family unity, often reminding everyone that family is the one thing a person must protect at all costs. Whenever disputes arose, he was the first to step in calmly, helping everyone settle matters without harsh words. People relied on him for advice, knowing he would never guide them wrongly. As the years passed, the man continued living in his steady, humble way. He worked, cared for his family, and helped his community whenever possible. In many ways, his life was simple, but to those around him, it was deeply meaningful. He represented strength, sacrifice, and kindness. Yet life has a way of testing even the strongest among us, and for this man, the test would come suddenly in a way no one could have predicted. On one particular evening, his day had been ordinary. He had gone about his tasks quietly as usual. There was no sign that the night would change everything. He left home planning to return soon. His family expected him back for dinner, and he promised he would not be late. It was just another evening, and he walked with the same steady pace he always carried. But on the streets that night, fate placed him in the wrong place at the wrong time. A police patrol was moving through the area, alert, watchful, and perhaps more suspicious than necessary. The veteran, with his calm presence, drew their attention for reasons no one could quite understand. He was not doing anything unusual, simply walking home, hands visible, posture relaxed. Yet suspicion has a way of creating tension where none exists. The officers stopped him, their voices sharp, their questions demanding. The man, true to his nature, answered calmly. He explained where he was going, why he was outside, and who he was. His voice was steady, his eyes clear. He had dealt with far more intense situations in his life, and he knew how to remain calm under pressure. But sometimes, calmness is not enough to prevent misunderstanding. The air grew tense as the officer's tone hardened. Perhaps they did not believe him. Perhaps they judged him before hearing his words fully. Whatever the reason, the situation escalated quickly. The veteran tried to maintain his dignity, but the officers became harsher. He did not fight back, did not raise his voice, but that did not stop what came next. One officer, acting without restraint, struck him. It was sudden, unnecessary, and violent. The man fell, his body collapsing under the blow. Shock spread across the small group of people nearby who had seen the moment unfold. His strong figure, the man who had endured so much in life, now lay still on the ground. Within minutes, the scene changed from confrontation to chaos. Someone called for an ambulance. His family was informed, rushing with panic in their hearts. When they arrived at the hospital, they saw him lying motionless, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Doctors worked urgently, but the news was heavy. He had slipped into a coma. His strong body, once unshakable, now lay silent, unable to respond to the voices calling his name. The hospital room became a place of both hope and despair. His family gathered, sitting by his side. His son, who had always looked up to him as a giant, now saw him vulnerable for the first time. It was a sight that broke his heart but also lit a fire within him. He held his father's hand, whispering words only a son could say, words filled with both love and pain. The beeping of the machines echoed in the room, a constant reminder of how fragile life had suddenly become. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers began visiting the hospital, offering prayers and support. The story of what happened started to spread quietly, carried from one voice to another. People whispered in disbelief, how could such a respected man, someone who had given so much of his life, be treated this way? There was anger, sadness, and confusion, but above all there was a growing sense that something bigger was unfolding. The officers, meanwhile, were unaware of the truth about the man they had struck. To them, he was just another figure in the night, someone they had chosen to confront. They did not know his history, his sacrifices, or the family he had raised. They did not know the identity of his son, or the position he now held. That knowledge would come later, and when it did, it would shake their understanding of the situation completely. For now, all that mattered was the quiet battle taking place in the hospital room. The veteran lay still, his body fighting silently while his family held on to hope. His son, filled with both grief and determination, stayed by his side, refusing to leave. In his heart, he promised that no matter what happened, his father's story would not be forgotten. The man who had lived with dignity deserved nothing less. And so the first chapter of this story closes not with resolution, but with questions hanging heavy in the air. A man who gave so much now lay silent. A family who loved him sat in anguish, and a son whose identity remained hidden to many was preparing for a path he never imagined he would have to walk. This was only the beginning of a story that would reveal truths, test strength, and demand justice in ways no one expected. But that night became the turning point of everything. When the veteran's body hit the ground after being struck, the world around him seemed to freeze. For those who saw it happen, the sight of a man who had always stood tall, now lying helpless, was unforgettable. His strong frame, which had carried years of service, years of responsibility, and years of love for his family, was suddenly motionless. The officers, instead of stepping back in regret, scrambled to control the scene. The veteran's breathing was shallow, his eyes half open, his lips moving slightly as if trying to form words, but nothing came. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, sirens slicing through the night air. His family was called. When they rushed to the hospital, panic written all over their faces, they saw him lying unconscious, surrounded by machines and doctors trying to stabilize him. The veteran had slipped into a coma, his body unresponsive but his heart still fighting. For his son, who entered the room moments later, the sight was unbearable. He had always seen his father as unbreakable, someone who could withstand storms. Now that same man lay silent, tubes running from his body, the steady rhythm of the machines the only sign of life. The days that followed were filled with waiting. In hospitals, waiting becomes its own kind of torment. His family sat by his side, speaking softly to him, holding his hand, telling him to come back to them. The son, in particular, stayed long hours at the bedside, staring at the still face of the man who had raised him. He thought about the lessons his father had taught him, the importance of courage, patience, and never backing down from what is right. In those quiet moments, he whispered those lessons back to his father, hoping he could somehow hear them. The hospital staff came to know the family well in those first few weeks. They saw the son's devotion, the mother's prayers, the relatives who visited day and night. Everyone hoped for a miracle. Some days, when a hand moved slightly or an eyelid flickered, they thought it was a sign that he was waking. But the doctors reminded them gently that comas were unpredictable. Recovery could take days, months, or might never happen at all. It was a cruel kind of uncertainty that wore them down slowly. Meanwhile, the story of what happened began spreading through the community. People who knew the veteran were outraged. He was not a man who caused trouble. He had always been a figure of peace, a helper, a neighbor people trusted. To hear that he had been struck and left in this state was heartbreaking. Whispers turned into discussions. Discussions turned into gatherings. Soon people were talking about it in local shops and barber chairs outside schools. They asked the same questions again and again. How could this happen? Why him? What will happen next? The officers involved tried to remain silent, but silence only deepened suspicion. They had no idea that the man they had struck was not just anyone, but a veteran with a son whose position and influence would soon change everything. At this stage, they only saw it as another incident they could push aside, paperwork they could file, and a case they thought would be forgotten in time. They did not realize the depth of the storm that was slowly gathering around them. For the son, the hospital became both a place of heartbreak and reflection. Sitting beside his father, he often thought back to childhood memories. He remembered the way his father had walked him to school on cold mornings, telling him that discipline meant showing up even when you didn't want to. He remembered how his father had fixed his bike late one night after it broke, even though he was tired from work. He remembered how his father's voice would rise in gentle laughter during family dinners, making everyone at the table feel safe. These memories filled the silence of the hospital room, reminding him of the life his father deserved to return to. But alongside the memories came a rising sense of determination. The son knew his father would never want him to simply sit and do nothing. He had been raised to believe in action, in standing up when something wrong had been done. Quietly, without telling everyone at first, he began to make calls. He reached out to contacts, shared the truth with people who could not ignore it, and started laying the foundation for what was to come. In the neighborhood, small vigils began. Candles were lit. People stood in silence, holding signs of support, not shouting but waiting. They wanted the veteran to wake up, but they also wanted justice. Their presence outside the hospital reminded the family they were not alone. Every night more people joined. What began as a few neighbors soon became crowds. Journalists started asking questions. Local media began reporting on the story, though not all the details were out yet. The identity of the son, his position, and the power he carried was still unknown to most. That truth was being saved for the right moment. Inside the hospital, the son continued his silent vigil. There were nights he did not sleep, watching the rise and fall of his father's chest, praying that he would open his eyes. He often thought about what he would say if his father did wake up. Would he tell him how proud he was of him? Would he thank him for all the sacrifices he made? Or would he promise him that no matter what happened, his story would not be forgotten? Those thoughts filled him with both sadness and strength. The doctors spoke carefully during their updates. Some days they said his condition was stable. Other days they warned of complications. It was like walking a tightrope between hope and despair, but the family refused to give up. They had faith in his resilience, in the strength that had carried him through years of service, through hardship, through life itself. The officer who had struck the blow, meanwhile, went about his days with unease, though he tried to keep his mind clear. He could not completely push aside the memory of the night. He did not know the man's full story, but he began to hear whispers that this was not a simple case. People were watching, asking questions, and attention was building. He did not know it yet, but the actions of that one night were about to change his life forever. Back at the hospital, time stretched slowly. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The family adjusted to living between hope and sorrow. They ate meals in the hospital cafeteria, celebrated birthdays quietly by his bedside, and marked the passing of seasons with the same view from the window. Yet through it all, the son never faltered. He was determined not only for his father but for the principle of what had happened. He knew the day would come when his father's story would reach the world in full. This was not just about one man anymore. It was about dignity, about respect, and about justice. The veteran's silent body in the hospital bed had become a symbol for many people, a reminder of how fragile life is and how quickly it can be changed by one unjust act. His son carried that truth with him every moment, preparing himself for the day when silence would end and voices would rise. And so, part 2 of this story ends with the family still waiting, the father still in a coma, and the son quietly moving pieces behind the scenes. Outside, the community was growing restless, their support deepening into something more powerful. The officers still did not know who the son truly was, or the strength of the storm about to break. For now, the hospital room remained quiet, but in that silence, seeds of change were already being planted, seeds that would soon shake everything around them. The hospital became a second home for the family as days stretched into weeks. The steady hum of machines, the faint smell of antiseptic, the constant shuffle of nurses' shoes on the floor, it all became part of their world. Every morning, the son walked in with quiet determination, greeting the doctors politely, asking for updates, and then taking his usual seat by his father's side. His eyes rarely left his father's face. He wanted to be there for every small change, every flicker of movement, every possible sign of recovery. But the silence of the coma was heavy. Sometimes when the son held his father's hand, he swore he felt a faint squeeze. Other times he convinced himself he saw the eyelids twitch. Whether it was real or not, he chose to believe that his father was fighting his way back. Hope was fragile, but it was all they had. The community, too, kept showing support. Outside the hospital, people gathered regularly, holding small vigils. They didn't chant loudly or disrupt the hospital grounds. They simply stood with candles, pictures, and handwritten notes of encouragement. They whispered prayers, sang softly, and left flowers by the hospital entrance. To the family, those gestures meant everything. They felt the strength of their neighbors wrapping around them, reminding them they were not alone. Inside, however, the pressure was building. Questions were asked about what had happened that night. Why was a veteran treated this way? Why was force used when there was no threat? The silence of the authorities only deepened the wound. Each unanswered question added to the frustration of the people who cared. The son knew he could not stay silent forever. He had been raised by a man who believed in standing up for what was right, and he carried that belief deep in his heart. But he was patient, he waited. He wanted the truth to come out at the right time, in the right way. In those quiet hours by the hospital bed, he planned his steps carefully, knowing one wrong move could weaken their cause. Behind the scenes, he reached out to trusted contacts. He spoke with people who understood both the law and the power of community voices. He gathered information, piecing together the events of that night. Slowly, a clearer picture formed. Witnesses were willing to talk. Neighbors described what they saw. Even strangers who had been passing by gave their accounts. Bit by bit, the son collected the truth like pieces of a broken mirror. What few people knew was that the son was not just an ordinary man. Over the years, he had built his own reputation in a very different field. Through hard work and dedication, he had earned a position of responsibility and influence. Those who knew him respected him not because of his title, but because of his fairness, his intelligence, and his ability to remain calm under pressure. These were qualities he had inherited from his father. The officers involved in the incident still did not know this. To them, he was just another family member sitting in a hospital room grieving. They had no idea that the very son they ignored was someone who could bring their actions under the harsh light of scrutiny. Time moved slowly in the hospital, but outside, momentum was growing. The media began to cover the story more seriously. News articles described the veteran as a family man, a neighbor, a quiet hero who had lived with dignity. The coverage wasn't sensational. It was human. People who had known him gave interviews speaking of his kindness and calm nature. Each story added weight to the truth of who he was, making it harder for anyone to dismiss him as just another case. One evening, as the son sat in the hospital room, he leaned closer to his father and spoke softly. "You always told me not to stay quiet when something wrong happens," he said. "You told me silence allows injustice to grow. I've waited, but now it's time. I won't let your story fade away." With that quiet vow, the son began to step forward publicly. He started attending community meetings not as a grieving relative, but as a voice of reason and determination. He spoke calmly about his father, about what happened, and about the need for truth. His words were not filled with anger, but with clarity. People listened. They leaned in. They believed him, because they could feel the honesty in his voice. And slowly, whispers began to spread about who he really was. Those who knew his background started sharing it with others. Do you know who his son is? People asked each other quietly. Do you know the position he holds? The news traveled like a ripple, surprising many who had only seen him as the quiet figure by the hospital bed. When the officers learned of it, their faces turned pale. They realized they had not just struck a man at random. They had struck the father of someone who could not easily be silenced. Suddenly, the casual arrogance they carried began to fade, replaced by unease. They knew the situation had changed completely. The son, however, did not flaunt his influence. He continued to speak with calm determination, never raising his voice, never making threats. He wanted the world to see this not as a clash of power, but as a demand for justice rooted in respect. His strength was in his patience, his clarity, and his refusal to let anger cloud his message. At the hospital, his father still lay silent, but his presence was powerful. Every visitor felt it. Every family member sitting by his side felt it. The room carried both grief and hope, sorrow and determination. The son believed deep in his heart that his father could hear him, even if he could not respond. That belief kept him strong. As weeks passed, the son's words reached beyond the community. People from other towns began to hear about the story. Messages of support arrived. Strangers wrote letters to the family, sharing their prayers and encouragement. What began as a local tragedy was becoming something larger, a symbol of resilience, love, and the fight for dignity. Through it all, the son stayed grounded. He still came to the hospital every day. He still held his father's hand. He still whispered memories and promises into the quiet room. But now when he left the hospital to attend meetings, to speak to groups, to face the media, he carried his father's story with him like a banner. He wanted the world to know not just about the injustice, but about the man himself, the veteran who had lived with kindness, raised his family with love, and served with honor. The officers could no longer hide. Their actions were under investigation, their choices questioned, their behavior dissected. The truth was catching up to them, and still, they had not faced the full reality of who they had wronged. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything. For now, the hospital room remained quiet, the beeping machines steady in their rhythm. The father slept, the son fought, and the world began to watch. The silence of the coma was powerful, but the voice of the son was growing stronger each day. This was no longer a private battle. It was becoming a movement, one that carried the weight of love, justice, and the unshakable bond between a father and his child. And so, Part 3 closes with the son's identity beginning to emerge, the officers growing uneasy, and the community standing taller. The fight for truth was no longer in the shadows. It had stepped into the light, and nothing could stop it now. The days inside the hospital were still long and heavy, but outside those walls, the world had started to change. By now, the community was no longer whispering quietly about what had happened. They were speaking openly, and their voices were growing louder each day. The son had stepped forward carefully, but now he could no longer hide who he truly was. The truth about his identity was beginning to spread everywhere, and it was changing the way people looked at the entire case. At first, people were surprised. Many had seen him sitting silently at his father's bedside, speaking softly, looking tired yet unbroken. They thought he was just a grieving son, someone who carried pain in his eyes but did not show it in his words. But when they learned what position he held, their respect deepened. He was not only the son of a veteran, but also a man who had carved out his own path of honor and achievement. He had authority. He had influence. And he had the power to shine a light on what others wanted to keep hidden. The revelation began slowly, through community leaders and trusted voices. Do you know who his son is? They would ask. People leaned closer, listening carefully. Once the truth spread, it carried weight. Suddenly, the officers who had acted with arrogance that night realized they were not facing an ordinary family. They had wronged someone whose voice could not be silenced easily. For the son, however, this was not about showing power. It was not about titles or influence. It was about his father, about dignity, respect, and justice. He made it clear in every meeting, in every public statement, that this was not a fight for himself, but for the man who lay in that hospital bed, unresponsive yet deeply present in spirit. His calm, steady words began to capture attention far beyond the neighborhood. Reporters started arriving, wanting to tell the story in full. Newspapers published his father's photo, showing a man who had served his country and lived with quiet integrity. The officers involved grew nervous as media attention increased. What they thought would fade into silence was now being spoken about on television, in articles, and across dinner tables. Investigations were announced and questions reached higher offices. The officers tried to defend their actions, claiming they had followed procedure. But each word they spoke was measured against the image of the veteran lying in a coma. And the balance was not in their favor. The son, meanwhile, carried himself with the same quiet strength his father had taught him. When asked about the case, he spoke with calm honesty. He did not shout or accuse wildly. Instead, he shared his father's story, about his service, his character, his kindness. He wanted the world to know his father not as a statistic, not as a victim, but as a man who had lived with honor and deserved respect. People listened, and many were moved to tears. Inside the hospital, life was still fragile. The father's condition remained unchanged. Machines continued their steady rhythm. Nurses moved in and out, and family members rotated their time at the bedside. The son never failed to be there, no matter how many meetings he attended or how many interviews he gave. He always returned, sat quietly, held his father's hand, and whispered his heart out. He told him about the people outside who were supporting him, about the voices that were rising for him, about the justice that was slowly coming closer. "You are not alone," he whispered. "The world knows now. They are standing with you." As days turned into weeks, crowds outside the hospital grew larger. People came from nearby towns, some holding signs of support, others bringing flowers, and many simply standing in silence as a show of respect. It was no longer just about one man in a coma. It had become about what he represented. His story had become a symbol of how dignity must be protected, how voices must be heard, and how injustice could not be ignored. The son's full identity was now widely known. News channels introduced him not just as a grieving child, but as someone with authority, someone who had achieved great things in his own career, someone who had influence far beyond the community. And yet, despite all of that, when he spoke, he always returned to one thing: his father. "Before anything else, I am his son," he said during one interview, his voice steady. "He taught me how to live with integrity, and now, even as he lies silent, he is still teaching me. I will not let his lesson go unheard." The officers felt the pressure building. Some avoided public appearances. Others gave short, nervous statements. But it was clear the tide had turned. The son's voice, amplified by community support and media attention, had grown too strong to be ignored. Authorities were forced to investigate deeply, and every step of the case was now under the eye of the public. In quiet moments at the hospital, the son often thought about how strange it was that life could change so quickly. Just weeks ago, his father had been walking home, planning to have dinner with the family. Now the entire country seemed to know his story. He wished none of it had happened this way. He wished his father could be the one speaking, laughing, telling his own story. But since he could not, the son carried that burden with pride, determined to honor him in every word. The family, too, found strength in the support around them. Though they were still filled with sorrow, they felt less alone. Each card left at the hospital, each flower delivered, each kind message reminded them that their pain was shared by many. It did not heal the wound, but it made it bearable. The turning point came when a large public gathering was held in honor of the veteran. People filled the square, holding candles as the sun set. The son stood on stage, his father's picture beside him. His voice, steady and clear, carried across the crowd. He spoke not of anger, but of truth. He spoke of his father's service, his kindness, his belief in respect and fairness. He spoke of the night that changed everything, not to stir rage, but to call for justice. And when he finished, the crowd rose in silence, candles glowing, faces solemn, hearts united. That night, news outlets broadcasted his speech across the nation. Millions watched, and the story became impossible to ignore. The officers who had once believed they could escape accountability now realized the reality. They were at the center of something much larger. Their actions were being scrutinized not just by the community, but by the country. Still, through all the attention, the son remained the same. He still walked into the hospital each morning, greeted the doctors politely, and sat by his father's bed. He still whispered stories and promises into the silence. Fame and recognition meant nothing to him. What mattered was his father opening his eyes again. And so Part 4 closes on a world transformed. The son's full identity was no longer a secret. The officers had been exposed. The community had risen. The story had grown into a movement of dignity and justice. Yet at the heart of it all, in a quiet hospital room, a father still lay in silence and a son still held his hand, waiting for the day when he would finally wake. The hospital room was quiet as the first rays of morning sunlight fell across the veteran's face. Weeks, then months, had passed in a steady rhythm of hope, fear, and unwavering determination. His son had never left his side for long, balancing meetings, media interviews, and community support with the simple human act of sitting beside his father and holding his hand. Each day had been a test of patience, resilience, and belief in something larger than themselves. That morning, the son entered the room as usual. The soft beep of machines greeted him, a sound that had become both comforting and heavy with worry. He sat down, his fingers brushing against his father's, whispering stories and memories as he had done countless times before. But this day felt different. There was a subtle change in the air, a quiet tension, almost like a signal that something was about to shift. He spoke softly, recounting moments from their lives. "Do you remember when we built the treehouse together?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "You taught me how to hammer nails carefully, how to measure properly, and most of all, how to never give up. I'm still trying to follow your lessons every day." He paused, letting the words sink into the silence. "I promise, Father, your story will be told, your dignity preserved, and now, it's time for you to come back to us." Suddenly there was a faint stir. A finger twitched. An eyelid flickered. The son leaned closer, hardly daring to breathe. Nurses, who had grown accustomed to the long silence, noticed the subtle signs immediately. The veteran's hand moved slightly in response to his son's touch. Machines beeped in a slightly altered rhythm, as if marking the first steps toward life. Moments stretched into minutes as everyone held their breath. The father's eyes began to flutter, and then, slowly, deliberately, they opened. The first thing he saw was his son's face, weary but unwavering, full of love and determination. The son's lips curved into a small, relieved smile. "Welcome back, Father," he whispered, his voice breaking. Tears filled the room. The family gathered, holding him close, embracing him as if to make up for the time lost. The veteran's voice was weak at first, but it came. I'm here," he murmured. His son grasped his hand firmly. "Yes, Father. You're here, and you're not alone." The recovery was gradual. Days turned into weeks, each one bringing small milestones. The first time he sat up, the first time he spoke more than a few words, the first time he laughed quietly at a memory shared with his son. Every achievement was celebrated quietly, with a mix of relief and joy that only those who have faced such uncertainty can understand. While the veteran regained strength, the case against the officers progressed. The son's voice, amplified by his identity and the support of the community, had become impossible to ignore. Investigations were thorough, conducted with scrutiny at every level. The officers were held accountable for their actions. Some faced suspension, others faced formal charges. It was a justice measured, careful, and precise, intended not to humiliate but to ensure that the wrong done could not be repeated. The public attention remained, but it had shifted from outrage to a deeper understanding of resilience and accountability. People spoke about the veteran not as a victim, but as a man who had endured, as a symbol of quiet strength. They spoke about the son, not as a figure of power but as an example of patience, love, and determination. His calm, steady approach had turned grief into action, injustice into awareness, and personal loss into a story that could educate and inspire. As the veteran continued to recover, he began to speak more about the night that changed everything. His voice was calm, measured, and full of the dignity that had always defined him. He described what had happened without anger, but with clarity. He acknowledged the pain it had caused, the fear, the helplessness, but he also spoke of forgiveness, of the importance of learning from mistakes, and of the need for understanding. The son listened carefully, absorbing every word, knowing that these moments were precious. He had been fighting for his father's story even while he lay silent, but now he could witness the man himself telling it. The experience strengthened their bond, deepening the love and respect they held for each other. Every conversation, every shared memory became a building block in the long process of healing, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Outside the hospital, the community continued to rally, though in quieter, more celebratory ways. People who had once stood with candles now shared meals, helped rebuild spaces in the neighborhood, and offered assistance to families who needed support. The story of the veteran had sparked a wave of human kindness that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. It reminded people that one act of injustice could lead to awareness, compassion, and collective responsibility. The officers involved were required to attend community service and training programs designed to educate and prevent such incidents in the future. They met with the veteran and his family, not as adversaries but as part of a process of accountability and learning. The meetings were emotional, full of reflection and acknowledgement. Apologies were offered, not as a formality but as a genuine recognition of the harm caused. The veteran accepted them, understanding that change often comes from such difficult moments. In time, the veteran returned home. The house that had been quiet and waiting now filled again with laughter, conversation, and the gentle rhythm of everyday life. He could walk steadily, speak clearly, and even begin small projects around the house he had long wanted to complete. The son remained by his side, not out of obligation, but out of love and the unspoken understanding that their journey together had grown even stronger through the trials they had endured. The story reached far beyond their city. News articles, documentaries, and interviews shared not only the events of the night, but the lessons learned from it, the importance of dignity, the power of patience, and the resilience of the human spirit. People everywhere were inspired by the bond between father and son, by the strength found in silence, and by the calm determination that could turn tragedy into positive action. In quiet moments, the father would sit with his son, looking out of the window at the neighborhood they had always loved. They spoke about ordinary things the way they had before the incident, but now with a profound understanding of life's fragility. "I am proud of you," the veteran said one afternoon, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "You turned pain into purpose, grief into action. You carried me through in ways I could never have imagined." The son smiled, tears in his eyes. "You taught me everything, Father. I only did what you would have wanted me to do, and now you're here. That's all that matters." In the end, justice had been served, but more importantly, life had returned to its quiet, steady rhythm. The veteran's recovery was complete, his dignity restored, and his story preserved not only through legal accountability but through the love, respect, and awareness it had inspired. The officers learned lessons that would stay with them for life, the community became stronger, and the son carried forward the values that had defined his father. The narrative closed not with anger but with hope. A man who had been struck down had returned, his family and community stronger for the ordeal. And the bond between father and son, forged through years of shared life and tested by unimaginable trials, emerged unbroken, resilient, and enduring. Through pain, silence, struggle, and determination. The story showed that human strength is not just in physical ability, but in love, patience, and unwavering commitment to what is right. And as the veteran and his son walked forward together, hand in hand, the world around them learned a lesson that would not be forgotten, that dignity, courage, and humanity are always worth fighting for.